Hello and welcome back. Following last week's video when I mentioned the dreaded Adobe DNG file format, I had a few comments from people regarding what they believed was my incorrect assertion that the files were much larger than raw files. And having done a little bit of research into this now, I was wrong in that aspect, but I was right in other aspects. So at the risk of alienating even more people, I'm going to take a deep dive into the pros and cons of using Adobe's DNG format. So let's dive in and take a look. So the question is, to paraphrase Shakespeare, to DNG or not DNG? That is the question. And of course there are arguments either way. So let's just firstly look at what is a DNG. And of course the DNG is Adobe's digital negative file format that is supposed to be a universal format that can be read by lots of other different softwares. But of course, if you're using any sort of raw conversion or raw processing software, it will read pretty much all of the current file formats. And one of the arguments put forward by some people to say why you should change to DNG is that what happens if your camera manufacturer, say Nikon, Canon or whomever, goes out of business, will you still be able to read your files? Well, of course you can, because the existing software can read it, so the fact that the manufacturer of the camera has gone out of business is irrelevant. It doesn't make any sense. But there are other arguments in favour of using the DNG format. And yes, it is an archival format and it can be read by lots of software. That's true. And another argument that came up is that using the DNG format, your raw files are actually a little bit smaller. And that's true, and that's where I was tripped up before, because I've always just used the camera manufacturer's raw format and kept them that way. And when I've used the denoise in Lightroom or the HDR software and it's converted the images into a DNG format, the files come back much larger size. But when I went back and did an experiment and imported some images from another source and converted them to DNG on the fly, yes, certainly the file size was a little bit smaller. And so, yes, that argument was correct, but I'm also correct when I say that if you then take that DNG file and use Adobe's, well, what I regard as Adobe's very inferior denoise option in Lightroom or Camera Raw, your file will come back substantially larger. But that's not really counting against using the DNG format. There is some argument that the files may render faster in Lightroom. I haven't checked that out, but it may or may not be the case. And as far as an archival format, well, if you really wanted to archive your files, a file format such as a TIFF has been around a long time. It's pretty much an archival format. And no, it doesn't allow you to reprocess the raw data, but it is an archival format. So, you know, if archiving your files is a concern and you think that somewhere down the track the current software will not be available, that's something to consider. It's also claimed that DNGs have a self-validating feature that will check for corrupted files, or that allows you to check for corrupted files. Well, if that's the case, then that's a plus. But the other option for using DNG format is that if you're still working on an older version of Lightroom or Camera Raw and you have a newer camera, your older format software won't be able to read those files, and you can certainly import them and convert them to a DNG and it will be readable in your older version of software. So there's a few arguments in favour of DNG, and the other option is that when you process your camera manufacturer's raw file, a sidecar file is created that contains the processing, and that exists alongside your raw file. Whereas with the DNG, all of that processing is written into the DNG file. So you could argue either way that that's a plus or a minus, but it's certainly a different feature for using a DNG. So looking at your import dialog when you go to download some images from your camera or card reader or external hard drive, this is where you have the option of converting to DNG on the fly. And this is where I did a bit of a test. So you certainly have the option of doing that, but let's just cancel out of that now because I've created or imported some files and I've done a little bit of a test on it. So Here we have a number of images taken last year, and so firstly I have the Nikon RAW file as imported, and you can see here that it is actually 58 megabytes. And I've done the same thing with that file, but imported it and converted it on the fly to a DNG, and yes, it's a little bit smaller. It's 52 megabytes, and essentially the same file, although there is some argument that says there is a little bit of metadata that may be lost in that process, depending on the camera manufacturer's information that's embedded in the file. But let's say yes, certainly with a straight conversion, there is a little bit of a space saving in importing it and converting to a DNG on the fly. But where we went a little bit differently was when I said, okay, if I took that same file then and took it into the develop module, which we're just doing now, and went in to use the detail tab and went to apply the noise reduction, it makes a big difference. So here's the file where I did the noise reduction using Adobe's software, and it came back as 113 megabyte. That's where I said originally that the files were much larger. Now all we've done is apply denoising, and it's created a duplicate of that file, and it's a much bigger file size. So then we have the option of, well, what would happen if I used that same file and did it in something like Topaz AI, which is this one. So it came back as a DNG, and wow, it went up to 260 megabytes. So using any of that denoising software, it is going to substantially increase the file size. And of course, if you start off with a proprietor's RAW file and you use either of these denoising options, you're going to get a second file that's going to be much larger. And in this case, the Adobe version is smaller than the Topaz version. But if we go and do a comparison of the files and zoom in, you'll see that on the one hand, the Lightroom version on the left hand side is not very good, and the one on the right hand side, there is much more detail applied. So yes, while the Adobe version of the noise reduction file is a little bit smaller, it's by no means as good. So you've got to make your choice there. So that's one aspect of using the DNG format. So as I said, one of the differences between DNG and using the proprietor's RAW format, such as Nikon or Canon, is that when you do your processing, those processing steps are written into a separate file. So let's just have a look in here in the Windows Explorer window and have a look at the differences. So here we have a DNG file, and as you can see, it's slightly smaller than its Nikon RAW file equivalent. But when it comes to the actual processing steps, which is this XMP file here, it's only 11 kilobytes. So one advantage of using the Nikon or Canon RAW format is that when you do your backups, if you've done your downloading correctly, you would have already made a backup of the RAW file, and after you've done the processing, all you really need to do is back up the XMP file. And of course you can see it's a very small file. They're all pretty small files, depending on what you've done with the processing, but by no means anywhere near the size of the original RAW file. So there's pluses and minuses with all of that, and you can see here where the original file converted into a DNG was 53 meg, and then doing the denoising in Topaz Photo AI became 266, and the Lightroom version was 115. So there's a lot going on in those files other than doing that denoising. And so that's one aspect we need to worry about. But certainly, if you are wanting to copy your RAW file with the processing and send it to someone else or onto another computer, well, it's a simple matter of just copying both of these files and putting them onto the other computer, and they'll be able to be read. So having the processing steps written into the RAW file, yeah, it's a matter of preference. I don't think it's a real advantage or disadvantage either way. So let's just quickly look at another file to make sure that this wasn't an anomaly with just that file conversion. Here's another file from that same trip. Again, 44 megabytes for the raw file, and where's the original? 45 for the DNG. And of course, when we start to look at different versions of this, they start to jump up. So it's pretty much across the board that the file size increases dramatically. So at this point, there's pros and cons with either format. What else should we be worried about? Well, certainly from what I've seen and what I've read online is that if you're using a proprietor's RAW format and converting it to Adobe DNG on the fly, some other software doesn't particularly like that. And I believe that Capture One is one that, unless it's a native DNG, it doesn't particularly like that format. But I don't use Capture One, and perhaps some of you viewers might be able to feed me the right information on that. And the other thing is to consider if you're going to convert a whole lot of original RAW files into the Adobe DNG format, there could be a time factor involved, and if you're intending to do that for archive purposes, then I'd suggest you do that before you go to bed and let it run and do all that processing. But certainly bear in mind that if you're going to make that decision and say, well, I'm going to stop using the camera manufacturer's RAW file and convert all my RAWs to DNGs, you're initially going to have 2 copies of each file. So you'll need to have lots of file space before you then can go and delete the original file format. So just bear that in mind. So there's not a clear-cut answer one way or the other. And it's particularly if you start doing other processing on files such as that denoising and other things, you may end up with a much larger file size anyway. And of course, one thing that's important if you do convert to DNG, your original file is not going to be changed, but the data is going to be written into the file. And the other thing is that apparently the Adobe color profiles are not written into that DNG file the same way that a RAW file will have the manufacturer's original color steps written into it, but you're going to change that anyway in the processing. So the question at the end of the day is, should you change the DNG or should you not? And my answer would be, if you're already using the DNG format, stick with it. If you're not using it, there's a few pros and cons. You can decide for yourself whether it's a worthwhile thing to pursue. But for me, I don't think there are clear-cut advantages or disadvantages either way. So I'm sure there'll be lots of comments afterwards, and I look forward to reading those. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.